Good evening and welcome to Metro Focus. I'm Jenna Flanagan. Could President Trump resign before Democrats even get the chance to impeach him? One of his former confidants and colleagues thinks that's a real possibility as Congress investigates the president's dealings with Ukraine. Barbara Ress knows him better than most. She's a former executive vice president of the Trump Organization and worked on some of the company's biggest projects. So when Ress said this on CNN, it got people talking.
It would be very, very, very bad for him to be impeached. I don't know that he'd be found guilty, but I don't think he wants to be impeached. I think that's what this panic is about. And my gut tells me he'll leave office, he'll resign, or make some kind of a deal even, depending on what comes out.
For more on her thoughts on President Trump, I'm joined now by Barbara Ress. Ress is also an attorney, public speaker, and the author of All Alone on the 68th Floor: How One Woman Changed the Face of Construction. Barbara, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
So I just want you to elaborate a little bit more on what it was that you told CNN.
You know, you put me on the spot, which is fine, asking me what I thought was going to happen with the whole process with the impeachment. And, you know, I told him, I'm not, you know, I don't have a crystal ball or anything like that, but my gut tells me that Trump really does not want to be impeached. He doesn't want that on his record. He doesn't want his presidency to reflect an impeachment. And I think that he would quit before that happened. So that's why I said he'll probably resign. And that's just, you know, it's my gut opinion based on things I've seen him do in the past.
Well, and before we get on to your relationship with President Trump, I do want to get a little bit of a perspective, though, because he seems like the type of personality who enjoys a good fight. He enjoys being able to spar with someone. And it seems like this is the type of thing where if the Democrats vote to impeach him in the House, that the fight that could ensue between Republicans in the Senate and perhaps Democrats in the Senate is something that he would thrive on. Is that a fair assessment?
You know, normally I would agree with you. He loves to fight. He loves to pit people against each other and see who's the stronger. But in this case, he doesn't have any power, and that is what makes it different. And you know, he had a taste of that when he was when he shut down the government and had to deal with Nancy Pelosi. And it was really the first time that he was ever dealing with someone that had every bit as much power as he had, and he did capitulate in that case.
So then how does someone like President Trump, should he choose to resign, sell this to his supporters? Because a big part of his appeal to his supporters is that I'm the tough guy. I'm the guy who's going to get in there and fight no matter what. And I can't be defeated by, say, snowflake liberals.
Well, you know, what do his supporters do for him if he resigns? Does he really need to sell them anything? It's, you know, he can tell them go to hell. He doesn't need them if he's resigning. He needs his financial interests and his backers and, you know, Turkey and other countries that give him the opportunity to build Trump towers on their space. So I don't think that would be a big deal for him, to be honest with you. As far as making it up, you know, putting perspective on it. Oh, there's a million things he could do, and he'll come up. You know, truth does not enter this. So he could say that he's saving the country because people are arguing too much. He could say he's saving the Republican Party. You know, it's certainly, no matter what he did, it would never be this was my fault. It would be this is what I'm doing for America.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned this was my fault, because he's also comes across as someone who is not fond of or perhaps rarely ever apologizes. And yet you, working with him as a colleague, were one of the few people who actually got an apology out of then businessman, now President Donald Trump.
Yeah, that happened. We had an enormous fight, yelling and screaming at each other and saying things that were way out of line. And the next day, I went home. I got through a little bit of I blew out 2 tires on the way home. I was so upset. And the next day, I went into his office and I said, Donald, I'm sorry, I was out of line. And he said, I was out of line too. And that's the closest I've ever heard him come to an apology.
Well, tell me a little bit more about the relationship, at least the professional working relationship that you had with him. Was he as adversarial as we see him now? Was he a different person, perhaps, when you first came to know him?
Well, he was a different person, but the elements were there. He certainly was very adversarial. We had an incredible relationship. We were very close. He was almost like a big brother in a sense to me. And we learned from each other because, I had my specialty, he had his. So in time, I left after Trump Tower and I came back and worked again, working on development projects primarily and not so much construction. And I did see a change in him. And the change had to do, I think, with the fact that he became somewhat famous. I mean, we used to walk to meetings in the city. Now he has a bodyguard wherever he goes, and he drives everywhere. He doesn't walk anywhere. I don't mean now. I mean at the time, that I went back. So I saw those differences. I also saw a bunch of people working for him that were not, they were, probably high quality, but they were very much, I don't want to say the word yes men, sycophants maybe, which was unusual for him. He used to have people that stood up to him more and more, and I was seeing that the new people were not like that.
Well, it's interesting that you use the phrase, I don't want to say yes men, but perhaps sycophants. And the only reason why I bring that up is because that seems to be a rhetorical rhetoric that we see from the president from time to time, where he'll say, I'm not going to say X, but X, Y, and Z someone else might say. I ask that because we've seen a recent article from George Conway, who, of course, is the husband of Kellyanne Conway, and he's flat out said that the president is in mental decline. I'm wondering if you've seen any sort of change that might indicate something like that, or what are the changes that you've seen since the last time you interacted with him personally versus the president who we now see on television?
Well, for one thing, I don't know that he's I'm no psychiatrist, but neither is George. I don't know that he's in mental decline. People say, well, it doesn't take a psychiatrist to know that this guy is a narcissist or whatever it is. Well, we knew that. He was like that years ago when I worked for him. And he was volatile and he was nasty and unfair. I mean, but, now those things have taken him over. The biggest change, to my mind, that I can see, and I'm sort of interpreting this a little bit, is the fact that he doesn't listen to anyone. And he did years ago. He listened to people. He had advisors. He did what they told him. Now it's him telling people what to do and them jumping how high. That's the way I see it.
So how do you see, perhaps, I mean, depending, of course, on what the House chooses to do with this impeachment inquiry, but how do you see the Trump presidency going forward, or perhaps how do you see the Trump organization going forward post-presidency?
Well, part of it would depend on how he left the presidency. If he quit, if he was impeached and convicted, or if he just lost in the next election. Those are three different things. The Trump organization, I don't think ever stopped, but it's questionable as to what exactly the Trump organization is and whether or not it's nearly as successful as Donald says it is. But I see that going forward, and I see, barring him having a horrible scandal that would totally mar him, I think he continues to build in other countries, and you'll see those Trump towers go up in Moscow.
What would you say to someone who says, you're just a Democratic operative, if you will. You were a Hillary supporter. You're against the president. And so, of course, everything you're going to say should be questioned and viewed with a level of suspicion.
Well, what can I say? I mean, anyone that's watched me, seen me, read my book, knows that I am 100% consistent. I have not veered off my message since when I was opposed to his presidency. I've gotten a little harder on him. I was very soft on him. And the more I think about him and the more I see what he's doing, I'm a little bit not soft pedaling like I might have been in the beginning.
There's been some already talk that perhaps even if an impeachment does happen, President Trump will not leave the White House, that he will fight, that he literally will have to be removed. Do you see that as a fair assessment, or is that just going too far?
I heard that and I laughed. I don't see it as a fair assessment. I don't. What's he going to do? Sit in a chair and have somebody pick him up? I don't. I don't see that. He'll figuratively be yelling and screaming, especially if he gets defeated, if this all goes away and he gets defeated. But he will have to leave. He's not going to cause a major event like that, a coup, whatever you want to call it. All this is bravado. This is all coming out of his mouth. And it's just the first thing that comes into his head. And then he amplifies it and he makes it stronger and stronger and stronger. But no, is he gonna refuse to give up the presidency if he loses? I don't think so.
Okay, and then, of course, the president's Twitter feed, which we have come to rely on as his actual mouthpiece. Do you see the tweets stopping? Do you see them continuing? Do you see them ramping up in perhaps their rhetoric in nature?
I think that, well, mostly what he does is rhetoric, but I think that, that's his way of communicating. That's his way of coming in here and coming out there without anybody saying, well, Donald, maybe that's a little rash. I mean, this whole Turkey thing, there was no information, no advice on any of that. And I see it continuing right to the very end. Whatever he's doing, at that moment, he'll be tweeting about it, in my mind.
Of course. So, final question. If there was a piece of advice that you could give the president right now, what would it be?
Well, first of all, I would tell him to shut up. I would also tell him to lose Giuliani because I think that he's not doing him any good. But I do think that at this point in time, the president should probably resign.
All right. Well, listen, Barbara, I want to thank you so much for giving us your unique insider perspective into President Trump, the man who we as New Yorkers thought we knew, but the country is getting to know as president. So thank you so much.
My pleasure.